So I saw a thread where there was a request for an explanation of what critiques are, and I saw a few ideas batted around, and I thought that I could contribute to this by running through a real quick primer on the concept behind critiques. Now, this is not meant to be exhaustive. This is not how-to on how to write one or how to debate one. This is just trying to capture what a critique is. One of the things that it isn't, which it's not the same as a procedural theory objection, although they are associated with one another, they both fit in a larger category that other arguments don't fit in. And then finally, to talk you through three categories that I have known a lot of coaches who coached a lot of critique debating, that they use those when they're introducing the concept. So to begin with, I sometimes hear people say, well, if they won't write this or that detail into the plan, then you just run a vagueness critique. That's not a critique. Now what it is it's a procedural objection based on theory. What you're saying is, because of the way debate works, if my opponent has set up their argument in this particular way, that so disrupts this debate from happening that they should lose the debate. Topicality is an example of a procedural objection. Plan vagueness is a procedural objection. They should lose the debate because they ran a counterplan, or they ran the counterplan conditionally, or they tried to sever part of their plan, or they made an argument and then tried to take it back. They tried to do a position shift without granting an argument we had made to get out of what they had originally said. For any of those things, you can, in the middle of the debate, say, now what they have done it's so watered down, it's so hurt their advocacy that we no longer have an idea what it is that we're supposed to debate. We no longer have any confidence that they are going to stick to their position, or they haven't given us enough details to where we can take a position. So therefore, the impact to that, the remedy for that, is that they should lose the debate. And I'm going to give you a real simple test for how you can tell a procedural theory objection from a critique. The reasoning behind why you should win the debate when it is a procedural theory objection always comes down to this. It always comes down to saying that the judge is going to have to make a decision to award a win to one side or the other. And the verbal shorthand that usually goes with that is the better debating was done by. So the judge has to make a decision the better debating was done by. When it's a procedural theory objection, you are saying, because of what my opponent has done, when you go to make that decision, who did the better debating, you cannot make that decision rationally, because we did not cooperate sufficiently in observance of the rules for the debate to be joined. It's like when you have to disqualify someone from running a race for a severe rules violation, because the race itself is no longer a fair test of who could run the fastest. So you say the appropriate thing to do is to award us a win and our opponents a loss, because it was their choice that made this debate no longer a fair test of who was the better debaters, because they didn't give us enough ground, because they wouldn't stick to the ground they originally occupied. All those arguments are procedural theory objections. They are not critiques. Now, they have one thing in common with critiques. Most of the arguments that you make to try to win a debate have to do with the substance of what your opponent is saying, whether what your opponent is saying is true or false. If you follow the reasoning of what your opponent says, where do you wind up? So if you're negative and the affirmative says that there's a problem, there's a root cause to the problem, meaning it won't vanish on its own and action is required, here's our proposal solves the problem. If you can eliminate any of those arguments by refuting them on their own terms, there really is absolutely no problem. Their proposal really would do absolutely nothing about that problem. Their proposal's already been passed. So, as far as the likelihood that the problem will continue into the future, it's gone away. If you can join them on any of those issues and completely defeat what they have to say, then you're debating them on the merits of what they say. Or you can say, well, let's go along with them and say the proposal was passed. What would happen then? What bad consequences might there be? And then you're debating disadvantages. All of that, you're debating them on the substance. With a critique, what you're doing is you're making an argument about how they have argued. You are making a claim about the argumentative speech act, that what they did in making that argument had an effect. And one other thing that tends to be true of critiques, one other identifying element of a critique, is it will take their argumentative speech act and it will put it in a category. It will say that their speech act is part of a system. Their speech act is recognizable as one example of a larger category, and then they make claims about that category. So you may have noticed that if you're going for topicality, you don't have to win uniqueness. As a matter of fact, that probably sounded like kind of a weird sentence. What would uniqueness even look like for topicality? But the thing about a critique is you don't have to win uniqueness for that either. The only thing that's relevant in a topicality debate is, in this debate, you ran a non-topical plan. If someone runs a critique and you say, well, that's non-unique, the system you describe, that'll exist whether we argue this way or not, they'll say, but what happened in this debate is what's of concern. And even the linking is a little bit different. I mean, what's the link to a topicality argument? Well, it's the particular part of the plan they can point to, the particular use of a word, the inclusion of a provision, something like that. That's your violation. And really, I would say their entry point to debating you on a critique has more in common with the violation part of topicality than it does with a link to a disadvantage. It's not typically a cause-effect argument. It's typically, here is a pattern. Here is something we have recognized, and that's our way into this critique debate. Now, with all of that set up, what I think may help a little bit is if I give you just a real quick introduction to the three types of critiques you're most likely to hear. The first is a critique of language, and a critique of language is very commonly misunderstood. If you've heard of critiques of language before, then probably the example you've been given is you would run a critique of language if someone used an offensive word. So if someone if the affirmative that you were debating against, if they had a provision written into the plan that the plan was whites only, then obviously that's offensive. And especially if they put a racial slur right there in the 1AC, then that's offensive. They should be punished for using offensive language by losing the debate. You know what? That argument would have flown before anyone thought to recognize that there was a type of argument called a critique. What critiques of language far more commonly do is they say that language has certain framing effects. Language has framing effects. So when you describe something using certain language, it changes how you think about it. And we actually, a couple of years ago, just spontaneously here on our campus, and not among the debaters, funnily enough, we had a critique of language pop up because we had a group of students who started challenging everybody else to stop using the word lucky. They said, we want to abolish the word lucky from our campus, and where we used to say that we were lucky or that was good luck, instead we want to start calling those blessings and say that we are blessed, because the word lucky makes it seem as though good things that happen in our lives are random and came from nowhere. But when we call them blessings instead, then we acknowledge what the source of all blessing is. And they weren't saying the word lucky is offensive and you should just be punished. They said using the word lucky gets you thinking in the wrong directions. Let me give you one other example. This one that actually did happen in a debate. This is a lot of years ago. It was some debaters from my alma mater, Baylor, and they were debating the University of Michigan. The University of Michigan was affirmative, and it was a pollution topic, and the University of Michigan was changing the laws regarding the dumping of toxic waste and other pollutants on Native American reservations. And all through the first affirmative, and even written into the plan, they used the word tribe. And Baylor, my alma mater, they critiqued that. And they said using the word tribe is the problem. Instead, you should be using the word nation. And they said the word tribe frames these people groups as primitive, because tribes are primitive. Tribes are nomadic. Nations, on the other hand, are negotiated with as equals. And the United States has enough of a history of broken agreements with Native Americans that when we call them tribes, it's effectively the same as if you have a pack of wild dogs on your land somewhere, you might go and get some meat to try to lure them into a trap so you could take them away. Well, if you're dealing with tribes, you're dealing with Native Americans as other animals. So if you dangle an agreement in front of them, you know in the back of your mind you're not going to let them have that agreement. You're not going to live up to it. The protection that you're promising to them is just an illusion to get what you want. But if you think of them as nations, if you frame it that way, then a treaty is binding. And if we enter into a treaty with another nation, then we are preparing ourselves for that use of language to follow through on that. So that's one category that you'll hear a lot of the time. I remember that the first year that there were critiques in policy debate at the college level, we had a legal topic, and there were lots of critiques of the legal system. And I may talk about some of those when I get to critiques of systems in a minute. But then the second year, the topic was to change development assistance policy to a list of nations in Asia, in South Asia. In the University of Texas, they were the pioneers in spreading critiques and policy debate. They had a grand old time that year critiquing the word development, because they would say, your plan is probably a good idea. Sending food to people who are hungry, that's great. But it's the word development. It's the idea that these people are beneath us. These people need to be brought up to our level. Yes, they have a simpler life. Yes, they have fewer possessions. You know what? They have fewer ulcers. They have less mental illness. In many ways, their life is just as satisfying as ours is. They probably have more contagious infectious disease than we do. They have a lot less obesity. It's this essentializing that we are up here and they are down there. That's the baggage of the word development. Once again, it's a framing effect. So the Texas debaters would say, you've already made the arguments and you even wrote it into your plan, so you're stuck with that word and you've got to debate it. And if we win that development is a bad concept that should be discarded, then the fact that you're entangled with it, that's a reason you should lose the debate. So that's one example. Particular language that is necessary to an argument you're making, or even language that's written into the plan, that could be the negative's way into a debate. Now, a second category of critiques is oftentimes there will be critique of a particular kind of argumentative move, So, Arthur Miller, back in the 1950s, wrote a play, staged it on Broadway, and the play was a dramatization of the Salem witch trials. The play was called The Crucible. And he was doing this because it was around the time of the McCarthy pursuit of communists in the State Department, in the Army, and in various other government agencies. And Arthur Miller was making a point that when you take something that's abstract, something that is a silent conspiracy in your description of it, and you turn it into an existential threat, a threat to the well-being of the entire community, and then you treat accusations as self-proving, and you only allow people who are accused to repent, to admit that they're guilty, and to, willingly take the punishment, and if they do anything else, if they defend themselves, if they say the accusation is not true, you treat that as proof that they really are evil and enemies and in need of punishment. He said, we have done that multiple times in our history. We did it at the Salem witch trials. We did it in the Spanish Inquisition. We've done it other times. And when there are those kinds of self-sealing accusations, we do terrible injustice, and we're doing it again right now in the McCarthy hearings. So that's a whole string of arguments put together. But one of the things that you will hear, one of the things that you'll see as far as critiques, is there are particular kinds of arguments, particular kinds of argumentative moves that are the way into a critique debate. One of the years that I was coaching, the topic was that there should be substantial changes to procedural rules in the federal criminal court system governing pretrial detention and sentencing. A very common argument that you heard all year long was that prosecutors had too much discretion, and they would abuse that discretion in ways that were very unjust. And so then the affirmative plan would be written to set out standards that limited prosecutorial decision-making and prosecutorial discretion. Well, the University of Texas, again, they had a critique that they wrote, and it was out of work done by Michel Foucault, and we called him Food Court. But one of the things Foucault said is, most people misunderstand the nature of power, and they think that power is something that can be held in check, when really what power does is it flows into whatever configuration is available. And power is not something that is typically exercised from the top. The real interesting understanding of power, according to Foucault, was right down at the bottom level, where he said power becomes capillary, where the officers to whom the authority is delegated, when they go and carry it out, put the handcuffs on people, that's where power is being exercised. Now, out of all his work, he came to some conclusions that when you try to check power, When you try to control, rein in, put a block in the way of power, all it will do is it will, by normalizing certain behaviors, by reshaping what's expected, the power will just flow into another configuration. So, Texas's link to this critique was your affirmative says that there is power, the power is being abused, and we will check the power. And then they would read a lot of Foucault's work and Foucault's explanation of that's not how power works. And they would say, so your solvency goes away, and there's a very high likelihood that we win a solvency turn. Because when the power reconfigures itself, when prosecutors find their way around to a new way to exercise the exact same power, then it's going to be harder to find the next time around, because right now we know where it is. Right now it's in plain sight, and all parties involved can adapt to it. But when it flows into a new configuration, it goes underground and becomes covert, and that is a net turn to your solvency. So, another example of a particular kind of argumentative move that's a link into a critique. And STOA has the international relations topic next year, so this is something that you might want to have a look at. There's an author by the name of James Derderian, D-E-R-D-E-R-I-A-N, and he has a number of books on this, but he writes extensively about threat construction, about how we will take the data that is available to us and the face that we see in the clouds, the schema that we impose on all that data is that it's dangerous. Because when we can find danger, there are all of a sudden a lot of interested parties that can benefit from that danger because they can make a living off it. So we construct threats, we build up our defenses to keep us safe from threats. Those defenses then trigger the people that we had framed as threats. They then feel legitimately threatened because we're building our military capacity up, so they then build up to defend themselves, and it becomes an arms race, and the arms race came out of nowhere. And they'll say that you, the affirmative in the 1AC, are guilty of threat construction. And that what will happen as a result of threat construction is it's self-fulfilling. You bring about, and you bring about in worse fashion, the very impacts that you claim that you do away with. So argumentative moves can also be a link into a critique. They recognize certain things, certain ways that you're making the argument. They say, this pattern is characteristic of a larger system, and here's how this system works. And they will then explain it's likely to work this way again in this case. Finally, the last example, I've talked about your argumentative move fits into a system, or your use of a word has a framing effect because language itself is a system. This is going to get a little confusing because the third and final category that you see a lot with critiques is the critique of the system itself. They will say that all the arguments you make depend necessarily on the existence of a certain system and you are entangled with it. Let me give you a real simple example that I think will be easy to understand. Let's say we're having a debate in 1861 in the Deep South, and let's say that your affirmative plan is we will make it against the law for overseers to whip slaves. They can no longer use whips. And if they're going to use any kind of corporal punishment, then they have to document the reason that they did it, and the slave has to be given a chance to explain what happened. And this is this nice little affirmative that is going to make slavery a lot more humane. And I hope that you see this coming, because the negative stands up and says, but our critique is against the entire system of slavery. Slavery itself is fundamentally unjust. Slavery itself has to be abolished, and what the plan is doing is the plan is putting whitewash on the system. The plan is treating a symptom, not the root cause of the illness. The suffering and the cruelty is not the whipping. The suffering and the cruelty is being owned. So the problem is the entirety of slavery, and dealing with one of the excesses or abuses of slavery is entirely inadequate and actually makes things worse. It's likely to give longevity to a practice that even now, because it is so horrible, is actually in danger of collapsing. But if you make it look more humane, if you take the edge off some of the worst of the abuses, then you're likely to prolong it. So I remember one of the last years that I was a full-time coach of college debate, the topic was that you should change federal law regarding employment discrimination on the basis of race and or sex. And Michigan State University, their light bulb went on very early because every single affirmative was going to do with how workers were treated in the workplace. And they knew that their judging pool was all a bunch of college professors and graduate students, so they went to the library and their critique was Marxism. They said having a boss and employees is the problem. It's not discrimination. Discrimination is a symptom. It's like trying to clean up the whipping of the slaves instead of abolishing slavery itself. The bigger problem is capitalism. And so they got very, very good in debate rounds at talking about what Marx and all of his successors had to say were the failings of capitalism, and especially in the negative block where they have all that time to explain and all that time to read a lot of evidence to say this problem is systemic in nature. You deal with one symptom, you're doing nothing. There will be a new form of oppression, there will be a new set of outrages. Maybe it won't be based on sex or race anymore, but it'll be based on something. There will be technologies of control. The only thing you're going to do is you're going to make the whole thing look less abominable than it did before. You're going to put a coat of whitewash on it. So that's an example of a systemic critique. All right. So if what you're saying is that the way your opponent made an argument, it's unfair and makes the debate impossible to judge fairly, that's a procedural. Vagueness is not a critique. It's procedural. If you're saying the way your opponent made an argument is in some particular way bad, not just bad for the debate, doesn't just make the debate hard to judge properly, but in some way that imprints the world is bad, then that's a critique. One of the questions that was asked at the beginning of this thread was, are they always pre-fiat? And in my experience, they tend to be always both. So back when Baylor made the argument about tribes versus nations, they said if the word tribe is written into the plan, when this plan hits the courts, when this plan goes to regulators who are going to administer it, then the word tribe imprints them. So that is a solvency takeout and quite possibly a turn within the world of debate. But they said the impact is also on all of us because we've been throwing the words around now, and you as the judge ought to vote to endorse. So you ought to vote negative and say, I'm not going to call them a tribe. My vote, negative, is refusing to call them a tribe and choosing instead to call them a nation. So that all of us, when we leave the room and we go out and we deal with people in our communities who are Native Americans, we think of them as another nation deserving of respect. And that agreements we make with them are binding. And that is a real-world impact, and therefore pre-fiat. When it comes to the argumentative moves, they do the exact same thing. So they say threat construction means that the plan is likely to turn itself. It's likely to make the world a more dangerous place. But it's also the case that all of us, in listening to this narrative, that the data we've collected means that we're in danger, so we have to build up our military, all of us have once again been subjected to threat construction. And if you, the judge, will vote negative and say, I am breaking out of this, I am recognizing it for what it is, that's an act of resistance, and that sets the precedent. And then finally, the same thing with critiques of systems. So Michigan State would say that if you rejected capitalism, if you said the problem is not discrimination, the problem is that there is a workplace to begin with, then that itself is a political act. And that is the first step in not treating the workplace as something inevitable that we're just stuck with. So as far as the question of are all critiques pre-fiat, the really, really savvy critique debaters tend to make them both because they know that some judges are very, very reluctant to vote on the pre-fiat impacts that, when I vote, it's a political act and it changes how I see the world. There are some judges that just wave that away and they say, no, we've gathered together for this to be an argumentation lab and I'm going to go judge another round in about 15 minutes. I'm going to forget your round, to be perfectly honest. So those debaters will make sure that they say, this also turns the case. This also is a solvency takeout. This has impacts within the world of the debate. But there are enough judges that respond well to that and say, well, I do learn a lot from my participation in the debate community, and it does change how I think about the issues that most negatives or most teams deploying critiques, they will make the argument work in both worlds as something that changes the thinking and the speaking of the participants in the debate, but also as something that is a substantive argument within the world of the debate. Now, I haven't said anything at all about critique affirmatives, and maybe that's a video for another day, but that is just my real quick primer on what a critique is. And I hope that that makes it make a little bit more sense. And if you have any questions, follow-ups that you want me to take up, as always, send them along and I'll get to them just as quick as I can.